graduate students, we can use mindfulness in order to not only reduce stress, as Dante mentioned, but also find greater resilience and greater success as graduate students, as faculty, as staff, wherever we are in our lives. Mindfulness is essentially just a intentional, non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. That's as stated by John Kabat-Zinn, one of the founders of Western science-based mindfulness. It is based in evidence-based practice. It's something that we can practice in everyday life. We do not have to be yogis. We do not have to sit in silent retreat for days on end in order to build our own sense of mindfulness. It's simply a way of being awake and alert to everything in our lives. Because when we think about it, so much of what we do is done on autopilot, on cruise control. And when we race through our lives in that way, just towards the next goal, the next deadline, we are absorbed in the worry and the anxiety that comes with, well, what happens if this? What happens if that? Or worrying about the past and, well, what if I'd done something differently here? Or what if this hadn't happened? When we're able to place ourselves and center ourselves simply in the present moment, we're able to find a lot more resiliency to those challenges that we encounter. So the basis, the important thing here is that mindfulness is really intentional, right? It's also very non-judgmental. It's our way of accepting the circumstances and confluences of our lives and working with rather than trying to get around those challenges. And simply being aware of both the inner and outer landscapes of our lives and how we work with them. Mindfulness is not just zoning out, it's actually tuning more closely into our lives. It's not simply breathing. Breathing is a very strong component to mindfulness, as we'll talk about in just a moment or two. We also like at Center to emphasize that it's not a religion. Mindfulness does have many bases in Eastern philosophy and specifically Buddhism, but it also has roots in just about every significant culture and religious and philosophical grounding around the world. We all practice mindfulness in our own ways, regardless of whether or not we recognize it or call it that. And then finally, it's also not a quick fix. It is a way that we can reduce our stress, that we can improve our quality of life. But the practices that I'm going to share today are ones that require us to incorporate them into our larger lives. It's not something that we do once. We get a shot and okay, I'm good now. I'm immune to stress. It's something that we constantly have to be working at, right? So as I said, at the center, we take a scientific evidence-based approach to mindfulness, and the medical and neuroscience literature over the past 3-4 decades has increasingly pointed out that mindfulness can be tied to greater degrees of life satisfaction, to autonomy or a sense of freedom and agency in our lives, to improve self-esteem, greater empathy and conscientiousness, two things that are very critical right now as a lot of our workforce goes through burnout and compassion, empathy fatigue coming out of this pandemic. And more critically for graduate students, mindfulness practice has also been associated with enhanced time management skills and increased self-efficacy or belief in our ability to do what we need to be doing. I know that one of the topics that Grad15 touches on every year is this idea of imposter syndrome or imposterism, or feeling like as a graduate student, do I belong here? Am I going to cut it here? Did I make the right decisions here? Mindfulness is one of those tools and strategies that we can use whenever we start to have those little panic and doubt bubbles coming up in our minds. Right. And finally, practicing mindfulness regularly in whatever way, shape, or form we do can also help us build resilience or the ability to bounce back. It has a dose effect to it, wherein the more we practice our mindfulness, not only is that practice stronger, but it also comes back to us more easily in high stress situations and instances. I always use the example of driving. Driving is very stressful to most of us in the Phoenix area. If you're like me, at some point or another, somebody has cut you off and you've immediately gone to give them that wonderful little hand signal that we're not going to do here, but we all know what it is. Mindfulness is not a guarantee that you're going to not have the impulse to do that. You might even get your hand part way up before you realize, no, I'm good. I'm going on with my day. This isn't catastrophic. It's not ruining my mood. I'm going to move on with everything else in my life. So these are a few of the things that we teach mindfulness can help us with. All right. So moving along, let's talk briefly about stress. That's something that all graduate students, many of us, are highly familiar with. Stress is a natural part of life, and not all stress is bad. We need a certain amount of it in order to remain motivated, to maintain our interest and our passion in things. We need to be challenged. We have these big, huge brains. They need to feel that they are being pushed from time to time. But when we are under chronic, constant stress, that's when we can see some harmful repercussions, particularly in the long term, such as work fatigue or burnout, and declining mental, emotional, behavioral, and physical health, especially, as I said, over that long term. And the diagram on the right-hand side of your screen here highlights some of those health impacts. We're not going to go into detail on that here, but I will share these slides with Amanda and Dante to pass along if anyone wants to have a closer look at these. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, what we're looking at here are some of the things that happen at a neurochemical and neurobiological level when we become stressed. When we are under stress, which is essentially our bodies and our brains responding to a perceived threat or danger, whether it be a cave bear or an upcoming paper, our stressors activate our automatic stress response, the so-called fight, flight, or freeze reaction that most of us have heard of at some point in our lives. When this happens, it triggers an elevation of our blood pressure, our heart rate, our respiration rates, and the rise of cortisol, our stress hormone in our bodies. And simultaneously, we experience the hyperactivation of the amygdala. It's a little almond-shaped and sized bit of our brain right in the middle of our brain that is the emotional control center of our brain. But at the same time, during this same stress response, as the amygdala is becoming hyperactive, the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning and rational part of our brain, becomes dormant. It's shut out of the conversation. And that's a really critical thing to understand about why we act, how we act when we're stressed. It explains why, when we're under extreme stress, we feel unfocused oftentimes, why we just can't think, we make dumb, stupid mistakes, or we become impulsive or emotionally driven, right? It's also why it's only after we have that stressful argument and we've had time, or we've been put on the spot in a meeting and we've had time to de-escalate afterwards, that we think, oh man, I should have said this. Why did I say that? Because that's our reasoning portion of our brain having that chance to reassert itself. So mindfulness as a daily practice is something that can help us break out of that stress spiral more readily and more quickly, and even give us that resilience not to get amped into that stress response as readily. All right. So let's talk about some some strategies, some very practical strategies that we can all adopt to lead more mindful, hopefully less stressed lives. All right. So mindfulness is like building a muscle. In order to make to make full use of it and have a full range of mindfulness range, we have to develop it through consistent exercise. All right. Just like going to the gym. And just as there are many, many ways that we can exercise our bodies that don't involve a gym, that don't involve a treadmill, don't involve that one thing that we really don't like to do, there are a lot of ways that we can engage in mindfulness practice, right? The first of these, and this is the most simple, is just observing the present moment, noticing the time, the space, and the place that we're in right now. Um, you know, a central tenet of mindfulness is that we exist in the moment because the past can't be changed. And the future really depends on our presence of mind to direct it right now, right? The decisions that we make, the decisions we don't make, those have bearing on what comes in the future. Anxiety and stress come from worry and rumination, either about what's been in the past or what is coming up for us. But if we can slow ourselves down and focus on, okay, this is where I am right now in this moment, this present moment is where stress doesn't exist. It doesn't live in this space, right? So ways that we can find that centering present, though, include simply developing a mindfulness practice. And that can be as simple as spending 5 to 10 minutes on a daily basis, maybe first thing in the morning or the last thing before we go to bed for the evening, of doing a meditation, guided or unguided. It can be a body scan meditation, various seated meditations or lying meditations, senses meditations, and there are a number of apps that we can find on our phones, Headspace, Insight Timer, Calm, that offer scripted versions of these meditations. We can do breathing and movement exercises. There is a box breathing strategy that we'll look at in just a minute or so, that is highly effective for triggering the release of the hormones that break us out of that automatic stress response. We can do yoga, we can do stretching, Tai Chi, basically anything that is a contemplative movement that we have to think about. We can make weightlifting a meditative, mindful movement, and that's we really don't want to rush it. We really want to be thinking about what we're doing, right? Because if we're just cruising on autopilot while we're in the weight room or while we're doing gymnastics, we're going to make a mistake. We're going to hurt ourselves. So anything that is reinforcing that mind body connection can be a very mindful activity. All right, we can also do practical experiential exercises, and that can be something like simply being mindful of what we're eating. Instead of sitting here in front of the computer stressing about this paper that won't write itself and pouring through entire sleeves of Oreos, been there and done that. We can actually notice what that individual Oreo tastes like and what it feels like as it dissolves in our mouths. And I really want Oreos now, so I'm going to move on to the next point. But we can also be mindful of how we're listening, of what's going on in our environments. Right now, for instance, I hear construction workers outside. I hear the AC system in my building. I hear water running in pipes in the office suite next door. And we can do journaling or reflection, simply sitting down for a few minutes to think about processing our day, processing how we felt when things happened, and digging beyond the surface level of I got angry or that frustrated me, but looking at why was this frustrating? Why was this threatening? Why was this a challenge? All right. So we're going to these next few slides, again, I'm going to just whiz through because I will share these. Um, but among those practices we can do are a body scan. This was my introduction to mindfulness a number of years ago. Simply taking 7 minutes first thing in the morning before I left for work and sitting quietly. It's a great way to build that mind body connection and awareness so we're more in tune with when we're feeling physical manifestations of stress in our bodies. But it's also a really great visualization exercise to release stress, right? I mentioned breathing. Simply doing a deep rhythmic breathing practice like the box breath is something that activates our vagus nerve. It is a large nerve bundle that weaves throughout our body and is responsible for telling our our brain stem that, okay, you're breathing calmly now. You're not hyperventilating, so you're not running from that cave lion. You're not running from that cave bear. It's okay for us to stop releasing cortisol. It's okay for us to be unstressed now, right? As I said, we can sit in mindful awareness, being aware of what's going on around us, doing a senses meditation. And we can do this in little bits of time. We can, as long as we find time to be mindful on a daily basis, it can be as simple as those 5 to 10 minutes doing a guided or unguided meditation or spending some time journaling. Can be doing a box breathing cycle before getting out of your car or while sitting at a red light, or taking 3 deep grounding breaths before going into a meeting that you know is going to be a little bit stressful, or an exam that you know you're a little bit anxious about. It's taking those moments to reflect on, well, why am I feeling this way? Why am I inclined to react to this way, to this response? Maybe we're having a conversation with somebody and we're feeling ourselves getting really anxious or even angry, or having an emotional response that we don't normally associate with ourselves. That's a really great point to step back and think, okay, I'm exhausted right now, or I've got this going on, or this is in the background of my mind. Okay, that's the rational part of my brain explaining why I'm having this reaction right now. As I said, we can slow down. We all eat multiple times a day. We can just notice what that process is like. We can pay attention to small things in our daily routine: brushing our teeth, combing our hair, movement itself, going for a walk between our classrooms and just noticing, oh, I hear birds. Oh, there's more of those pigeons. They're everywhere here today. Oh, that sun feels really warm. It feels nice this time of year for about 2 minutes. So these are all things that we can do to carve mindfulness into our lives rather than feeling like we have to take time out from our lives to do it. Okay. And we can also watch what we're thinking, watch how we're approaching life and our mindset. So much of being mindful is simply being aware and practicing what we call the attitudinal foundations of mindfulness. So, practicing patience with ourselves, with others, practicing non judgment. You know, we have on average 55,000 thoughts a day, and about 75% of those tend to be negative. So if we can stop labeling, that was a bad experience, this was a good experience, but this was an experience that I learned from, that non judgment can help us be more mindful and rational about what's going on in our lives. Non striving, letting go, acceptance. By these, I don't mean that we have no motivation, that we have no goals, but simply that we recognize what is changeable and controllable in our lives and what it doesn't make sense to dwell on, right? And we can do things that help our bodies naturally de escalate those stress responses. As I said, there is this wonderful little hormone called cortisol, which beyond building being a part of that stress response also helps us gain weight when we eat all those Oreos out of stress. There are specific hormones that do the opposite. They're what we call the feel good hormones, and that's things like endorphins and oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. These are neurotransmitters that are released in response to pain or stress. It's that runner's high, right? It's they are triggered by being able to be positively empathizing with others, by expressing compassion for people, by being connected and having a sense of belonging. Um, Dopamine, for instance, is part of our motivation, reward, and reinforcement cycle, and it triggers us to be optimistic. That's why when we're able to check off small tasks on a list, we feel pretty good about it. Even if there's a much longer list, we feel good for everything that we check off because we are activating and releasing those specific hormones. And we can create and produce those through exercise, through adopting a healthier diet, through simply spending time outdoors and getting that vitamin D, by listening to music, by indulging in deep, raucous laughter. Yesterday, I worked with a classroom of undergraduates, and I told them, okay, grin at each other as stupidly and cheesily as you can. You cannot be in a bad mood if you are making a fool of yourself, grinning at somebody or laughing. These are all things that release those neurotransmitters. Finally, connecting to your purpose, remembering why you're in grad school, what your goals are, why this resonates with your personal values, and then doing things that bring you gratitude and doing things that allow you to nurture compassion for others. Right? We talked about this, but creating agency where we can in our lives, whether that be creating a checklist and checking one thing off of it, or finding ways to assert ourselves more. Viktor Frankl was a philosopher, a neuroscientist, and a Holocaust survivor. He said that between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. And what he's speaking of there is that pause that practicing mindfulness gives us, so that instead of automatically reacting to stimuli, we are making the conscious choice to respond to it. And that's where we get our agency and our freedom. Right. And finally, probably the simplest thing that we can do when we're starting to feel those panic spirals and need to give ourselves that mental timeout and recalibration is simply going back to our breath, taking those few deep breaths and allowing that vagus nerve to activate those feel good hormones to start flooding our bodies and to kickstart that response to the stress response. And in doing so, we allow ourselves to reignite the connection with that higher processing and reasoning portion of our brain.
Thank you all again for taking the time out to engage with us and learn more from today from Dr. Reeves Blurton.